Before Dorothy is my imagined life story of Auntie M, Dorothy's Auntie M from The Wizard of Oz. Um, we don't really know much about Aunt M. I think for most people, they'll imagine her from the movie as quite a brusque, stern lady. But actually, my source material that I went back to was L. Frank Baum's original story, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And there is a fascinating couple of lines which I'll read because this was my absolute moment of inspiration to write this woman's story, not as a fantasy fairy tale, but as a very gritty, earthy woman struggling on the prairie through the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, raising her young niece. And here's what Baum writes. When Aunt Em came to live there, she was a young, pretty wife. The sun and wind had changed her too. They had taken the sparkle from her eyes and left them a sober grey. They had taken the red from her cheeks and lips, and they were grey also. She was thin and gaunt and never smiled now. So instantly, there's so many questions. Why has she changed? What has changed her? And in my mind, I wanted to understand who Aunt Em was before she moved to the prairie and was raising Dorothy. And who is Dorothy to Emily and Henry? Because it's never explained. Is she their actual niece? Is it a term of endearment? So there was a lot that we don't know. So to step into such a well-known world is, I suppose, quite a brave thing to do. But there was so much I didn't know about Aunt Em and her connection to Dorothy. So it just felt like a gift to somebody who's loved this story her whole life. And as I say, I wanted it to be very real, very grounded in the earth of the prairie. So I've set the story through the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, again inspired by those lines of change. What had changed? Well, the prairie changed dramatically. And it has just been an incredible experience writing this story and bringing Aunt Em to life in a new way. It's really always about making a character feel real. So taking Aunt Em away from that sort of brusque, stern, black and white woman we know from the 1939 movie, and really, as we know from The Wizard of Oz, bringing colour to her. So who was she as a young woman? I have her working in Chicago as a hopeful, young, ambitious young girl at the end of the war years with her sister, Dorothy's mother, and then falling in love with a man called Henry, who has ambitions to farm on the prairie. So the two of them really are dreamers, young, hopeful, ambitious couple who, as so many people did at the time, wanted to put their hands on the earth and claim something for themselves, as a contrast to being a man of industry. Chicago being because that's where The Wizard of Oz was written, that's where L. Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz. And plus it has those connotations with, sort of optimism, if you like, at the end of the war years. And so that change from the hope of Chicago to the reality of, well, actually, what's it like? And Emily knows nothing about farming and then ends up being on the prairie at the worst possible time. Then through a crisis, Dorothy comes to stay with them and has now got a child to raise. So that was the reason for the two locations, a slight nod to Baum and the original story. And that contrast really of the colour and hope of Kansas, of Chicago, to the sort of what becomes a very drought-ridden grey palette of Kansas. There was obviously always the question of the tornado, and as I say, this was never a book that in any way sort of goes into the fantasy world of Oz and the Emerald City. It's the prelude really to why does Dorothy imagine all those things. So there's lots of Easter eggs in the book about where would she get an idea of a talking lion, who's the Tin Man, where does that come from in her real life. And in terms of the dust storms, there were just relentless dust storms. And for me, this was a reflection of the menace of the Wicked Witch. So rather than this being a fantastical witch, the real menace, the fear for Emily and Henry is nature, is the prairie, is these looming dark, life-threatening dust storms that left thousands of people, children especially, affected by dust pneumonia. So the fear, the replication of that power and fear comes from the prairie, from the dust storms. The big storm of 1935, Easter Sunday, Black Sunday, is ultimately my, if you like, homage to the tornado of Dorothy's world in The Wizard of Oz. And really interesting to find stories about people who moved through the prairie at the time. The rainmakers I found fascinating. These magic men, you can see where I'm going there, who promised to bring rain to desperate farmers and, you know, sent explosives into the sky, and it's claimed to be able to control the weather. You pull back the curtain, can they really? So that was really a fascinating side of, you know, the Dust Bowl, and preying on people's vulnerabilities, which again, a sort of nod to the power of the wizard that Dorothy encounters. We really meet Dorothy happily living with her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry on the farm, and then she has this, well, whether it's real in the book or imagined in the movie, this trip to Oz. But what was her reality? And obviously, as a young couple who don't necessarily have children of their own, what is it like? So Dorothy herself is a bit of a destructive force in the lives of Henry and Emily, and I talk a bit about, you know, her, that, you know, what a child can be like, the noise, the mess, the sort of unpredictability of a child is a bit like a tornado itself. So yeah, it was really interesting to sort of imagine Dorothy's introduction to Emily and Henry, and what was that first meeting like, and how well did they know each other or not, and what happens to a child when their home changes. So there's lots in there about home and movement of home. And I have Emily's origin story from Ireland, so that was a lovely link back to what's now my home, and the play on the Emerald Isle, the Emerald City being, you know, Dublin. So yeah, there was lots of things to play with, but always keeping the book very earthy, very grounded, very gritty, literally in this terrible nature disaster, man-made, because of course, as you say, agriculture changed in that time, and the, you know, the greed of people wanting more from the land ultimately was their demise. And I think charming's the word, you know, and I think when you embark on something like this, where there is a known, well, many known iterations, and of course at the minute everyone's fascinated by Gregory Maguire's Wicked and the cinematic interpretation of that. But you've got to suspend that. I think you can't allow yourself to be shackled by, you know, sort of the fear, if you like, of what, you know, how will this be received, or what do we know? So again, for me, it was about understanding, okay, what do I know about these characters? But more importantly, what do I know about people who lived on the prairie at this time? What was day-to-day life like? What were their worries? What would the conversations be like at the dinner table, where often, you know, you couldn't set the table because a film of dust would settle over everything. So plates were turned upside down until you were ready to eat or had to be wiped. And so those are like the micro details, as I say, that lend the book authenticity, and imagining the conversations between, you know, a young child who's in a very strange environment. What would Emily and Henry be talking about at night when Dorothy's asleep? Then Toto arrives, obviously. But yeah, it was really fascinating as a writer to take little bits of what I know, but ultimately, you know, I'm creating a new story for them, and it has to feel real, and that comes from the research.